Man, I really have to use the restroom. If only there weren't two thrones.
Can you hurry up?
Occupied! Hello and welcome back to Gamebox, the show where we take a look at games of yesteryear. And today, we'll be taking a look at the final game of the original Sands of Time trilogy. A game that tried to mix the best of the two previous entries. A game that did have some new and interesting ideas, but failed in some way to implement them organically. A little game called Prince of Persia, The Two Thrones.
Should know that it was not love that drove him, but duty.
However, before we talk about The Two Thrones, we need to talk about a little game called Prince of Persia, Kindred Blades. Well, it was more of a work in progress than an actual game. As Kindred Blades, the ambitions were, well, ambitious. There were ideas present that didn't make it into the final cut. Due to time or resource restraints, I'm not entirely sure. But let's jump into it. Kindred Blades would have included different areas for the prince to explore, those being the streets and rooftops. This was to show off the different shifts in game feel. On the streets, the prince was to be outnumbered and hunted, but once on the rooftops, the prince became the hunter. Both areas were also meant to showcase the different social classes of the city, with the lower levels being where the poorer citizens would have lived, while the upper levels is where the richer citizens dwelled. There would have also have been a day-night cycle, as well as having a more open world structure. Another addition was the ability to transform into an entity known as the Dark Prince. The Dark Prince, as the name implied, was a darker representation of the Vanilla Prince. The Dark Prince was meant to be stronger and faster. The focus on the duality of the prince was not only aesthetics, but also steeped in the gameplay. The player would have been able to switch between the two forms. Fire would have been the activator, while water would have been the deactivator. The latter would have been kept in the final product. This would also play into the ending of Kindred Blades, as what form the player ended with changed the ending of the game, meaning that the game supported multiple endings, one for each form depending on whether or not the player collected all the health and the amulet upgrades. The main antagonist was different as well, originally being a sand creature that had taken the form of the prince. Farah was also not part of the original story, only being mentioned in passing. The voice work was changed once again, this time bringing in a sound-alike for Kylina, who was originally voiced by Monica Bellucci, and now is voiced by Sarah Carlson. Farah and the Vizier's voice actors were changed as well, switching out Joanna Wasik and Barry Dennen for Helen King and Harry Standofsky. Sorry if I butchered that. And with Rick Miller voicing the Dark Prince. And Yuri's back!
My boy!
Prince of Persia The Two Thrones was released on December 1st, 2005 on the Xbox, GameCube, PS2 and PC in the US, and December 9th, 2005 on the Xbox, GameCube and PC in Europe. The PlayStation 2 version was released on December 2nd of that same year for Europe. It was also released on the Wii and PSP on April 3rd, 2007 in the US and April 5th, 2007 in Europe, and was also released on PlayStation 3. Oh, before I forget, I had given two different release dates on my previous Prince of Persia videos for the PlayStation 3 release. The December release date was for the digital release of the original trilogy, and the actual physical release was April 19th, 2011. So yeah, my bad. The reception for The Two Thrones was pretty good, like the previous entries. With the new ideas and open world structure, Kindred Blades was shaping out to be a very interesting project. However, this was not meant to be, as the final release was trimmed down in scope and content. And with that, let's take a look at today's game.
Possible futures. This one held the most promise, but something has changed.
Okay, first things first. In order to talk about the story of this game, I do need to talk about the endings of both Sands of Time and Warrior Within. So if you haven't gone and played them yet, go do that. Oh, and come back and finish this video. Cool? Cool. The Two Thrones is set after the events of Warrior Within. As stated back in my Warrior Within review, there are two possible endings a player can achieve. The canon ending, which had the prince saving Kylina from a fated death, originally at the hands of the prince himself, and the non-canon ending, which had the prince slay Kylina and peace out back to Babylon. Since the saving Kylina ending is the intended ending, that's what's being shown. Plus, that's what the game starts with, so here we go. The two set sail back to Babylon for a new life together, but only find death and flames, as well as a new/old enemy. Their ship is destroyed and Kylina is taken prisoner. The prince rushes off to save her, and he doesn't, and she is slain by the vizier. You remember him. He's the baddie from the Sands of Time. But how? Didn't the prince defeat him in the past? So, let's go back a bit. At the end of the Sands of Time, the prince is able to return to the hourglass and reverse time to just before the battle at the beginning of the game. This allowed the prince to defeat the vizier and prevent the capture of the sands. But in doing so, the prince changes the timeline, making it so Farah never traveled alongside him. The prince changes the timeline once more with the ending of Warrior Within, with him saving Kylena and preventing the sands from being created as a result of her death. This changes the entire timeline. No sands meant no Maharaja to find them, so no temptation for the vizier to betray the Maharaja to Shahraman. I mean, he still betrays him because he's a dickbag, but hey, what are you gonna do? So, back to the present. With Kylena's death, the vizier creates the sands like the prince had done before. The vizier's generals, as well as the prince himself, are infected by the newly created sands. The vizier then plunges the dagger into himself and undergoes a transformation. The prince is forced to flee and now must find his way back and defeat the vizier and take back his throne. Now, if the Sands of Time was a bit soft in the combat category, and Warrior Within went super hard, where do you think the Two Thrones would fall? If you guessed stealth, then wow, that was a hell of a guess. So yeah, one of the new additions to the Two Thrones was a stealth mechanic, and with this new stealth mechanic was the addition of QuickTime events. Yes indeedy, you heard me correctly. Prince of Persia now has QTEs. This is only activated when the player does a speed kill move. This lets the prince thin out enemy numbers before an encounter, or just straight out avoid combat altogether. And don't get me wrong, it was an interesting idea, just not well implemented. The platforming remained relatively the same. There were a few new additions. They were okay, nothing groundbreaking. Dagger grates and jump pads, both of which didn't really flow with the fluidity of the established platforming. The same can be said about combat. This time around, the prince didn't feel like an unstoppable force mowing down pesky enemies. But here it does make sense, as the prince is being hunted by an army, and here the enemies do put up a good fight. However, some of the enemy encounters did come off as annoying, much like Warrior Within. Also, the whole combo list seemed pointless this time around. This was due to the enemy's tendency to block before combo was even finished, but overall, everything ran almost the same. Another new thing that was added was an object called the Sand Gates. These grant the prince new powers, which ended up being the same from the previous entries. There's Recall, the rewind of this game, Eye of the Storm, this game's Slowdown, Sand Winds, and Sandstorm, both of which are a strong ground attack, and much like Warrior Within, these moves can be interrupted by enemy attacks. Now, there are no moves equivalent to Haste or Ravages of Time from the previous entries. The other thing that the Sand Gates offer are Sand Credits. What are Sand Credits, you ask? Well, instead of letting the player unlock concept art by game progress or hidden achievements, the Two Thrones opts to instead grant the player sand credits that they would turn around and use to purchase said prize. But you can just beat the game and unlock all the art for your viewing goodness, so that was kinda pointless. Farah does make a return, though I felt she was not as present as she was in Sands of Time. But here, she is more of a hardened warrior than a captured princess, which is a nice change. Another new addition was a Dark Prince, an idea that was in the original Kindred Blades concept. His gameplay does differ greatly from the prince. He's equipped with a bladed chain, just like another PlayStation 2 icon. The Dark Prince is stronger than the Normie Prince. His attacks take down enemies in a few good strikes. Even his speed kill is easier to perform, going with the button mash rather than a time button press. Even the Dark Prince's platforming sections are different, if only slightly, adding in some chain swings. But to counteract his buffness is a slow, constant decrease in health. This was taken from the Sandwraith portion of Warrior Within, which I wasn't a fan of, and am not a fan of here. These Dark Prince sections, outside of the combat parts, had the player make a mad dash through an obstacle course in order to get to the next pool of water, in order to deactivate that form. Another thing that was taken from the Kindred Blades concept. The Dark Prince is also the voice in the prince's ear, and nags him on his choices. The banter between the three was actually pretty entertaining.
What is your favorite color?
Color?
Shall I repeat the question?
Blue.
Blue? That's not my favorite color.
What is the point of this?
Now, with Babylon being the main setting, one would think that it would lend itself to extravagant locations. Well, here the environments feel very samey. However, the Two Thrones did return to a more linear structure of Sands of Time, which wasn't an all-around bad thing. but given the original concept of Kindred Blades, it does seem like a bit of a step down. In certain points of the game, the prince will jump behind the reins of a chariot and raise a bit of hell, but these were few and far between, which was good because I wasn't the biggest fan of these sections. But hey, at least they tried something new. Now the bosses. The boss count was cut in half for this game. There were 4 in total, and each one did feel distinctive from another, and each one does use a speed kill mechanic in some way. The only ones that gave me trouble was the fight with the twins and the final boss fight with the vizier, but once I got down the attack pattern, it was smooth sailing from there. So once again, I'm using my footage from my PlayStation 3 run. Some things didn't look as good as a PlayStation 2 version, which is kind of par for the course. One of those things was the glow on the dark prince, which seemed to be non-existent in the PlayStation 3 version. The colors this time were okay. While not as dark and dull as Warrior Within, it still didn't match the bright feel of Sands of Time, so it ended up being sort of meh on that front. And of course that goddamn life bar was off center. The music ditches the electric guitar for a more orchestral feel, which honestly I wasn't the biggest fan of, as I liked the soundtrack of Warrior Within. I actually forgot it was there beyond a few small pieces. So, all in all, is this a game you need to go out and play? I'm going to give a soft yes. Yes, due to this being the final game in the original trilogy. Well, not really, but we'll get to that later. But at the same time, everything else beyond the boss fights were okay. However, I did encounter some minor glitches, one of which despawned the enemies in an area, disabling my ability to collect from a sand gate and forcing me to move on. Another was a glitch that was present in both the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 versions, where an enemy broke and started walking around in circles and was impervious to harm, which was actually pretty entertaining. In the end, I would say that this was a great end to a trilogy, but if I were to recommend one of them, this would be the rare case where I would recommend the PlayStation 3 version over the PlayStation 2 one. The PlayStation 3 version was less glitchy. Not only that, but the combat felt less tedious. I mean, sure, there were the graphical ticks, but overall the game was functional. Now, do I consider the Two Thrones my favorite out of the entire series?
No!
And sure, it did have its flaws, but I still found some enjoyment from it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go for a little joyride. Hey! Welcome to the end of the video. I thank you for making it this far. I do have 2 more games to play than will be completed with the Prince of Persia games. The next game I'll be taking a look at will be Prince of Persia, the remake. Or remakes. That'll make sense later. But until then, you know what to do. Spread the awesome, and I will see you next time.